Hello everyone, I'm citizen spokesperson Asher Westropp-Evans, and today is August 21st, 2024. This is the daily briefing of the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office, and we're live on Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and wherever afterwards you get your podcasts. So please start submitting questions in the chat, and as always, like and subscribe in order to help us reach out to that wider audience. Now today is day 320 of the October 7th war and the Hamas hostage crisis. Israel said yes to the deal, and Hamas said no to the deal. It's time for massive international pressure on Hamas to let them go. Hamas is still saying no to releasing hostages and ending this war, but it is saying yes to another October 7 massacre given the opportunity again and again and again as they promised. Just yesterday, we got explicit proof of this fact with Hamas publishing a letter to Hezbollah in which they state, and I quote, "We are winning, and it's time to finish off the Zionist regime." Hamas doesn't want to end its war against the people of Israel. Hamas wants to expand it together with the other Iranian-backed terrorist armies. And Hamas is waging a forever war against Israel, and the world must pressure Hamas to stop, to say yes to the mediator's deal, and to put this nightmare behind all of us. Because right now, Hamas has no reason to say yes. To put it frankly and in numbers, Israel has killed more than 17,000 Hamas murderers, destroyed 22 of 24 battalions, and killed 3 out of 5 commanders, more than 20 battalion commanders, and approximately 150 company commanders. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was killed, and Israel killed Hamas's military head, Mohammed Deif. Hamas cannot send a barrage of rockets, thousands of deadly rockets, we should specify, into Israel. And Hamas cannot make new rockets in facilities inside the Gaza Strip. Hamas cannot smuggle weapons into the Strip from Egypt, and Hamas can no longer invade Israel. By all these metrics and more, we can see that Hamas is losing on the battlefield. But that doesn't change the reality on the ground because it wants to drag out the war, because it thinks the global pressure will eventually force Israel to leave it in power. And that is why it plays these desperation moves and these desperation games, because it thinks that backed into a corner, it is in power. Hamas thinks that global pressure will allow it to rebuild, to rearm, and to do another October 7th again and again, as explicitly promised. So for Hamas, the only acceptable ceasefire is one where Israel ceases dismantling Hamas, while Hamas prepares to keep firing at the people of Israel. US officials are telling media, we don't know if Sinwar even wants this deal. Israel agreed to a deal, a bad deal, but one that gets surviving hostages back to their homes in Israel, which is the most important factor right now. Whereas Hamas only agrees to a deal where they keep the hostages to keep using them as leverage and continue planning attacks on the hostages' homes here in Israel. Israel retrieved the bodies of 6 hostages killed in Hamas captivity. Those 6 dead hostages were found in a tunnel under the humanitarian zone. Just to make that clear, under the humanitarian zone. Israel creates these humanitarian zones, and then Hamas uses them for very inhumane acts. Hamas uses anywhere Israel isn't located in order to fire rockets, to launch attacks, and most importantly, to imprison innocent hostages. The reason that Israel makes these safe zones is to try and protect Gazan civilians from their own leaders, Hamas. But Hamas makes unsafe zones by intentionally firing from inside the designated safe zones because it serves Hamas's interests to have Gazans die. Israel designated humanitarian zones where civilians could move out of Hamas strongholds in order to be in safety, but it never designated a safe zone for Hamas to abuse hostages or fire on Israel with impunity. Israel wants peace. Israel wants a ceasefire, and Israel wants a resolution to this war. But October 7th proved there can be no peace with the Hamas terror regime still in power. The displaced families must go back to their homes. They can't do that if Hamas is still their neighbor. And that's why we circle back around to the most important part of this, that we need the 3 Ds. We need to destroy Hamas, we need to demilitarize Gaza, and we need to de-radicalize the Palestinian society after 17 years of radicalization and incitement at the hands of Hamas. Now, in the meantime, the world must tell Hamas and its backers in Qatar, Turkey, and Iran that the time is up and you must let them go now. No, we won't let you prepare for another October 7th. And if you don't let them go, we stand with Israel as it fights to free the hostages. Now, elsewhere, Hezbollah is continuing to target civilians. Iran's proxy army in Lebanon fired 50 rockets into Israel just today. So far, more may still be coming. These rockets were fired straight at the town of Katzrin in the Golan Heights. Hezbollah fired hundreds of rockets into Israel just this week. And Hezbollah today destroyed a house in a city and hospitalized a man in his own home, while importantly, there was no military targets nearby. Now, Hezbollah said just a few weeks ago that they were targeting civilians in Israel. And Hezbollah continues to commit war crimes, again, with impunity, without accountability on the international stage. Now, Hezbollah started the war in the north on October 8th, just one day after the October 7th massacre, in solidarity with their brethren in Hamas. And since then, they've launched over 7,000 rockets, missiles, and drones at Israelis. Hezbollah has murdered dozens in Israel and displaced for over 10 months 60,000 people, forcing them from their homes inside Israel. Hezbollah must back off, or Israel will have to push it away. Now, today is also the International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. The UN is hosting an exhibit highlighting some of the world's worst terror attacks, such as 9/11 and jihadi attacks in East Africa and East Asia. And the UN exhibit somehow completely ignores the October 7th massacre. No mention at all of the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Nazi Holocaust, and one of the deadliest terror attacks ever, with around 1,200 people killed. The UN actually ignores any terror attack carried out against people in Israel. Palestinian terrorist groups are literal pioneers of terrorism. Let's not forget the airplane hijackings, the hostage taking, and suicide bombers on buses and in pizzerias. This is the pioneering action of Palestinian terrorists and their ilk for decades, since the foundation of the State of Israel. In fact, even before that time. Likewise, for UN women, concerned with gender equality and women's empowerment, women tend to be a bit less seen. In fact, even I'd go so far as to say unseen when those women come from Israel. There have been multiple reports, including from UN officials, of Hamas weaponizing rape on October 7th and afterwards. Documented reports that the Hamas themselves documented in their own atrocious and heinous footage. But in the last 9 months, UN women posted only twice about women in Israel, while at the same time period, UN women discussed Gazan women around 69 times. So the next time you hear the UN say anything, remember how they erase innocent victims when those victims come from Israel. All right, well, now it's time to take your questions from the audience watching live on social media, so please continue submitting questions. We're ready to receive them.
We're seeing lots of questions come in about the potential hostage deal. Jody is wondering, what will happen to the hostages if Hamas doesn't agree to the deal? And we're also wondering if you can clarify, has Hamas's rejection ended the discussion, or are there still mediations going on?
Well, Jody, thanks so much for your question. And the question of what will happen to the hostages should a deal not be achieved, well, they will continue most certainly to be used by Hamas as leverage, as tools in their sick game in order to perpetuate the war, in order to perpetuate their own sick power plays, in order to retain some sense of power, because that's exactly what these human beings are to Hamas. They are not truly human beings. They are simply tools and weapons of war leveraged to be utilized against Israel and against Israeli people to show that they retain some semblance of power, despite the fact that their battalions have been dismantled, their commanders killed, their weapons factories dismantled, and their capacity to rearm greatly diminished. They continue to hold on to power in whatever way they can, and the hostages are a primary tool for doing that. They hold that over Israel like a swinging sword of Damocles in order to try and prevent any sort of action to truly dismantle this heinous terrorist army, all at the expense of the Israeli hostages and, of course, the people of Gaza, who do not get to live in any true sense of safety while their masters from Hamas rule them with an iron fist and keep those humanitarian zones that Israel designates so unsafe by continuing to operate from inside civilian infrastructure, as they've done so, frankly, for the past 17 years, but most certainly since October 7th. As to what happens in the future and what future ceasefire negotiations remain on the table, it's hard to know exactly what can come from the next stages of ceasefire negotiations. But I will say that Israel and the Israeli people will not give up on getting those hostages home. And they will continue to fight and do whatever they can to try and bring them back. And if that means negotiating with such horrendous, bad faith actors such as Hamas, well, so be it for the time being. Those hostages must be returned home. And as I've stressed, and as we continue to stress here at the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office, day in and day out, this is the most important goal: to get Israelis back home, sleeping in their beds safely at night, and the hostages returned home now.
Our next question comes from X. What do you make of the disruptions and violence at the DNC in Chicago? And what about Iran's involvement?
Well, certainly, as we've all seen footage coming out of the DNC there in the United States, there are those outside the proceedings who would like to turn this into a political football of Israel, speaking out against Israel in this forum, and while the cameras are turned to the attention there in Chicago. But frankly, I want to move away from the specificities of partisan politics when it comes to the US and recall back the key element of the Israel-US relationship, which is that they are allies, the closest of allies. Israel and the US are allies going back to the foundation of the state of Israel. They are key partners. They are key partners of liberal democratic values who are fighting to ensure that those values are instilled and maintained and expanded across the globe, because that is the most important mission here, to fight against the sort of authoritarianism and tyranny that Israel is currently battling right now on 7 fronts, and that is being funded so much in large part by Iran and their militias. So as we've seen in the past, we had statements from the Director of National Intelligence come out in the past talking about the tentafadas that took place on US campuses and showing how there were elements of those operations that were being supported, backed, and even in some cases funded by Iranian regime interests. Perhaps that might be happening again. We can't know. We don't have the intelligence to know that explicitly right now. But what we can know for sure and for certain is that no matter what element of the US political spectrum you come from, no matter where in the US political space you come from, it is so important to retain that relationship with Israel, a key and clear ally here in the Middle East, to espouse the sort of values that we in the Western world all value and hold so dear.
Our next question comes from Debbie. What is Israel going to do about the violence taking place in the West Bank?
Look, Israel is looking to spread largely and collectively to ensure that there is peace maintained across Israel and across all elements of territory controlled by and through Israel. The fact of the matter is, we need to understand, Israel has been through the sort of heinous atrocities of 2 intifadas in the past. They've seen the sort of actions that occur when violence spirals out of control, and it is so important within Israel and for the Israeli people that we focus on the key important message right now, which is getting our people returned back from the Gaza Strip, from the control of Hamas. That is a key element that we want to weigh in on and focus our message and intelligence on, that we make sure that Israel secures its borders against the 7 different fronts in which they are facing threats from Iranian-backed militias all over. And as we said earlier, we've seen the 50 rockets fired from Hezbollah just today that landed in civilian areas. These elements and so many more are critical to maintaining peace and security within the region. And we know from multiple actors that were a ceasefire deal to be agreed upon, there would likely be a significant de-escalation of tensions, at least for the short term. And that is the most important thing right now. And I think that is what everyone who is interested in achieving some sort of change in this heinous status quo that so many of us have been living through for the past over 10 months now, we need to make that change. We need to see that change. And we need that ceasefire to come in and help protect against that change. So I think that's really the goal that we need to be focused on right now in order to be able to move forward and get past the tense situation which we all find ourselves in the Middle East here in right now.
Our next question is about the north. How much is known about the tunnels in the north of Israel, and what are we going to do to stop weapons coming in?
As I've stressed, repeatedly throughout today's briefing, and I will continue to do so, the north is certainly a huge point of concern. We've had the likes of Colonel Miri Eisen speak to us in the past here at the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office about the hundreds, literal hundreds of thousands. I mean, current estimates put anywhere up to 200,000 rockets that Hezbollah holds, sitting on the border of Israel in southern Lebanon. This sort of firepower is frankly hard to comprehend and imagine, and it is something certainly that Israel is very aware of and certainly is concerned about each and every day. And that is why 60,000 Israelis have lived for so many months displaced from their homes in the north, unable to access their own homes in northern Israel, in sovereign Israel. And that is truly, an unsustainable status quo. These people have been displaced, they've been moved about the country, they don't have maintainable housing, and they're not able to simply return back to their homes. When it comes to whether it be tunnels, whether it be drones, whether it be missiles and rockets, the north is certainly a flashpoint that everyone is acutely aware of, where, as we've said repeatedly, Hezbollah needs to move back behind the Litani River, as they promised to do so in the wake of the Second Lebanon War back in 2006, in line with the UN Resolution 1701. These explicit standards should be held to. The international law should be held to in this regard, as was agreed upon in the past, as what is the mandate of UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping organization that is kept on that border, whose purpose is explicitly to maintain, as a peacekeeping operation, the standards that were set in the wake of Second Lebanon. And yet, we don't see that happening. We don't see Hezbollah acting as good faith actors. And although they claim to be maintaining some level of restraint, I don't see how 7,000 rockets fired at Israel since they joined their brethren in Hamas on October 8th can be constituting of restraint. That being said, we don't want to see an escalation of tensions. We want to see people being able to return to their homes, and that is the goal. So in answer to the question, it is something we are all here in Israel acutely aware of, acutely cognizant of, but that is exactly what we're doing. We're being alert, but not alarmed, and we're trusting in the IDF and our forces to ensure and maintain security along our northern border.
Our next question comes from Adam on Instagram Live. I agree with the 3 Ds, but how does Israel propose de-radicalizing the population in Gaza? Who will educate the children? And if it can't be Hamas or Fatah, then who will take the responsibility?
Adam, it's an important question that you ask there. And, frankly, the plans are being laid out, incrementally and with differing ideas as to how exactly these policies can be laid out. There have been particular plans that have been suggested in the past about collective organization of different Arab nations from the surrounding areas, who might work together to create a sort of peacekeeping force to help maintain order and present some sort of authority there in Gaza. There are a multitude of different proposals on the table right now, and I'm not going to go through each one and detail each in specificity, but rather to say the point of the matter is that the status quo with Hamas remaining in power simply cannot be maintained. That is the key point right here. They have proven themselves to not only be the worst of bad faith actors, not only to be an absolute heinous terrorist army, but with October 7th and the promise to commit October 7th again and again, they have proven themselves a completely unsustainable neighbor in any way, shape, or form, and ones that cannot be left in power in any way, lest they risk the sort of atrocities that they would commit if they had the power to truly do so. Israel has worked so hard to demilitarize the Gaza Strip, to destroy Hamas, to demilitarize the Gaza Strip. And yes, of the 3 Ds, de-radicalizing the Palestinian society is the sort of generational project that must be instilled. It will not be achieved today, it will not be achieved tomorrow, but it is a goal to be achieved throughout the next days, months, years, decades even. And the point is that we need good faith actors in place that can instill that sort of action. It has happened in various contexts in the past where populations have been able to move forward, move past the sort of radicalized extreme agenda that they've seen in the past and achieve some sort of sense of normalcy and reintegration back into the wider international community. And that is something that we hope for the people of Gaza into the future. But it must start with the destruction of Hamas and the disarming of the Gaza Strip so that we can move forward with that 3rd D, the de-radicalization of the Gazan society and Palestinian society as a whole. It is really so important, and that is why this is one of the key elements of the 3 Ds, albeit the one with the longest time frame.
Our last question today comes from Instagram Live. What is the best response to people who still accuse Israel of committing genocide?
I think that is actually one of the most fundamentally important questions, and one which I've been grappling with the question of genocide my entire life. For those who don't know, my own grandfather, Professor Colin Tatz, was a a key professor of genocide studies operating in Australia and studying the Holocaust, the genocide of Aboriginal peoples in Australia, and so many other genocides, the Armenian genocide and others throughout the world throughout his entire life. So this is a question of understanding genocide and understanding how to interpret it is something that I have actually grown up with and spent my entire life personally dealing with and understanding. But I will say quite clearly, there is no doubt that right now, what Israel is doing is attempting to dismantle a terrorist organization, Hamas, and a terrorist organization that operates from within inside civilian areas, that hides behind civilians in order to use them as human shields and justifying their own insane actions, their own horrific and cruel actions. And if we look to the actions of Israel, we can see very clearly with the humanitarian aid that continues to fill into Gaza, the Gaza Strip every single day, the designation of safe zones within inside Gaza in an attempt to try and separate civilians from the terrorist masters that attempt to control them, who do not respect those safe zones and make them, as I said earlier, unsafe zones, and the myriad other actions, not to mention the growth and flourishing of the Palestinian population inside Gaza over the last several decades. Just look at demographic charts and you can see those numbers grow out, that this is not a genocide, that accusation is frankly ludicrous. And in fact, I would call it projection. I would call it projection from those Hamas monsters who came in on October 7th looking to wipe out, murder, and kill any Israeli that they could, in an act that can only isn't called genocide because they were prevented from the true views and true actions that they would like to take. If left to their own devices, they would have cleansed their way, as they say so clearly, from the river to the sea, across Israel, killing any person that got in their way, no matter who they were, innocent, military, young, old, frail, sick, ill. It wouldn't matter to them. They would slaughter them if given the opportunity. So I call the accusations of genocide pure projection from those who wish to commit genocide on their own, if only they were given the power. And thankfully, the people of Israel, the IDF, and all our allies and supporters around the world prevent that sort of action from happening, because I shudder to think what would happen if Hamas were given their way in the future. And that is why I call the accusation of genocide so utterly and completely ridiculous. All right, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to watch us today. It is so important that we get these briefings out as far and as wide as possible. So please like, subscribe, and share. We'll, of course, be back at the same time tomorrow. That's 3 p.m. Israel time, 8 a.m. Eastern time. I've been Westropp-Evans. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Drop a comment below. Don't forget to like, share, and hit subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Until next time, stay informed and inspired. This is Dejobnik signing off.